So just so you know that's sort of the plan. We're going to try to stick with things up on the board, and I imagine that hopefully the visual will be good, but I'll try to talk through a little bit of what I'm writing down. I know we also have visually impaired folks here, so I'll try to do my best to be doing that. So please bear with me if I feel like I'm explaining something that you can already see on there. I'm doing that for more than just you guys, for the people who are recording and people in the room as well. Okay, so the plan for today, I was just going to talk a little bit briefly to try to calm you down, and then we'll look at some. We'll kind of run through the course very quickly. I'll kind of hit the highlight points, and then I wanted to sort of make up, like I did last time, kind of making up some problems, give you guys a chance to practice. We'll talk through kind of some of the more complex stuff in the course. I am going to post this tonight, so I can pop this up on here so you guys can see. Since I'm using Dr. Camera, if you have a great view of it, I don't know what the viewing angles are. Feel free to kind of move more towards the middle. I'm going to be using mostly this, so you want to be able to see what's up on here. I'm going to post this thing. It's a course outline study sheet. I've just sort of outlined the class in 3.5 pages. So I'll post that today. You can kind of use that as a document to work off of, see if there's things on there that you haven't studied yet. You're kind of like, what the hell is that? Maybe you have a chance to figure out what the hell it is. So I'm going to talk through basically what's on here very quickly, just to give you guys a sense. I can take questions, but really make them, if it's like I can't follow what you're saying unless you answer this question. If it's like, what if this is in this weird scenario, just talk to me afterwards or something, but so try to keep the questions to a minimum yourself. If you have a question and you think it's kind of specific, just write it down and then ask me after. But if it's like, I can't read what that is, or I don't know what you're saying, or I have a basic understanding issue, I don't mind taking questions. But let's try to keep it to a minimum. Okay, so general points about the midterm is tomorrow, as you guys know. Show up on time. I mean, it's early in the morning, I know, but obviously every minute counts, so come early to school. Plan to get here at 8:15 or something like that, so you don't have to rush at the last minute. You're just going to be more stressed out. That's in part because you really want to be calm and relaxed when you get the exam, so you read through it all the way. A couple of points that I would recommend that you guys all do before as you guys study. So this is the cover of the practice midterm, but it's also similar to the cover of the posted last year's midterm. You notice that there's these formulas on it. Those three formulas are going to be given to you as well on the cover of the exam. And it'll be exactly these three formulas. So one tendency is for people to look at those and be like, well, I'm going to be given those, so I don't need to know what they are. But it's really valuable to know when you should apply each of these. We're going to talk about those conceptually. But please do spend 5 minutes tonight just look at those formulas and know when they apply and what words are trigger words for these formulas are relevant. So please do take a look at that. We've got the deadweight loss formula, the elasticity of taxable income formula. So for example, about half the people make the mistake of using the percent change in T in the denominator. It's on the cover sheet. It's 1 minus T, right? So kind of look at that and be like, look, I don't have to memorize exactly the elasticity of taxable income formula. It's there, and it'll keep you from making a mistake. Particularly that mistake, which I guarantee people will make. So if you don't do that, you're already one step ahead of the curve. And then of course this benefits formula, which I never use, confuses the hell out of me, but it's there if you like it. Okay, so we can just talk kind of quickly through the course. I kind of think of the course being in a bunch of distinct chunks, especially in the beginning, and then it kind of mushed together a little bit. So I tried to, in this outline, sort of piece things into the proper places. We started with this kind of discussion about equity, efficiency, redistribution, Calvert-Hicks, Pareto. Right, so there's kind of a series of questions that could come from those issues. Let me just put this up here so you guys can be looking at that as well. So I put up here efficiency versus equity. Equity versus efficiency, we had redistribution, some of the economic rationales for that. So you want to sort of understand utility functions and how redistribution is affected by those utility functions, different scenarios, where these things matter. The key points to kind of take into any given redistribution question: one, if we have diminishing marginal utility and income, what that means is that $1 for a rich person has less value in terms of utility than $1 for a poor person. Right? And so that will affect redistribution, because redistribution is about taking money from rich people and giving it to poor people, right, in its purest form. I mean, that's the Robin Hood version of redistribution. And the question you want to ask is, well, how does that relate to the marginal utility of money? And the important point to know is you have to be looking at a comparable amount of money for that statement to be true. You have to be taking the same amount of money from a rich person and giving that to the poor person. If it's a different amount of money, if you're taking $20 from the rich person and giving 10 to the poor person, unless you know the utility function, you can't actually say if that's better or worse. Because the amount you took from the rich guy is more than you gave to the poor person. We know on a dollar for dollar basis, it has more value to the poor person. When you don't know that on the $10 for the rich versus $1 for the poor. So that's kind of an important point that you know, that people struggle with a little bit. And then Caliber-Hicks versus Pareto, you want to be really clear on what those are and how they interact with everything here. So the key points here I would make is the Caliber-Hicks criteria is about efficiency. It's about the size of the pie. It's not about who gets the pie. It's just about, did this action make the pie bigger or smaller, period. Right? And it's kind of linked to dead weight loss. Right? If something causes dead weight loss, it doesn't satisfy the Caliber-Hicks criteria. Right? So if something causes dead weight loss, it's by definition saying the pie is getting smaller. That cannot satisfy the Caliber-Hicks criteria, because the Caliber-Hicks criteria is about the pie has to be getting bigger. Right? So that's kind of one point, the pie between the Caliber-Hicks criteria and dead weight loss. The Pareto criteria is that everyone has to be at least as well off as they were before. And one person has to be better, at least one person has to be better off. The critical point about this is, when we're talking about better off, worse off, we're not really talking about utility, we're talking about like the dollars that they have, right? But in talking about the dollars that they have, we are talking about their utility. I mean, so there's kind of a link there. If something satisfies the Pareto criteria, by definition, it has to improve social welfare. Because no one is being made worse off, and at least one person is being made better off. Right? So that has to satisfy the social welfare function, unless there's someone in society who, when they get better off, we don't like it. Sort of an odd social welfare function, but maybe like when one person gets richer, we actually have diminishing marginal utility for their income. Like the guy everyone hates gets a $10 bill, like that might decrease social welfare. And that's possible. Like these things are all possible because social welfare functions can be different than just summing up all the utility functions for everyone. So you want to know about like sort of the link between the different types of things, the different types of functions you might see. So I'm going to leave it there because there's a lot of like notes on this, and I want to make sure we get into sort of the more analytic questions. But I'm sort of happy to take questions on an individual basis on that stuff. Then we had a whole section on tax incidence. So you don't have to read through all this here. Just know that it's there for you to take a look at when you're studying tonight or just reviewing tonight. This was really covering a lot of the one-on-one basis. The idea that incidence is a function of elasticity, and that they're related, and then dead weight loss is also related. So if you're comfortable with the relationship between those things, I think that's the most important point on these topics. So the idea behind incidence is the person who has the relatively more inelastic curve is the one who bears more of the burden, relatively more of the burden. That's the starting point for the whole discussion. And it also relates to dead weight loss. So if you have relatively more inelastic curves overall, is dead weight loss greater or smaller? More inelastic means less dead weight loss. Right. So let me again, I'll use this thing here. So just really quickly to show that visually. And if we can look at a product market with price and quantity, and demand and supply. I'll call it supply number one. And then I'll draw like another supply curve dotted here and call it supply number two. All right, so we have price quantity axes, we have a downward sloping demand curve, we have an upward sloping supply curve, we're labeled it S1, and then we've got a steeper upward sloping supply curve, S2, going through the same equilibrium point. Right. So if we look at demand at S1, and we look at a tax of some amount T, if you remember from API-101, how you get a tax wedge, all we really need to know here is that this gap between demand, the demand curve and S1 to the left of equilibrium is the amount of the tax. So if we are looking for a tax of amount T, all we have to do is go from the old equilibrium, move left until that gap between the two curves is that amount of the tax T. That will be the quantity that we see in the new equilibrium with the tax. So you can convince yourself of that. You can kind of shift one of the curves directly downwards by the amount of tax, and you'll see that you're either going to have the new equilibrium point being here or here. Either way, that's the quantity. So this is something we've seen over and over. We've seen probably 4 or 5 times now over the course of the year. And the point being that here we have our debit loss triangle, right? Being this triangle left of equilibrium and right of this tax wedge distance t. If we look at that for that same distance of t using demand at S2, the steeper supply curve, we don't have to go as far left from the old equilibrium to get that gap of t. You kind of see that here, like the distance between this demand curve and the supply curve, S1, is growing at a smaller rate than the distance between demand and S2, the steeper one. Right? If we move left to right, this gap here is growing slower than this bigger gap. Right? If these were 2 mouths of alligators, this one would be the more open mouth. It's a terrible way to think about it. But the gap is growing faster when we're looking at S2 and D. So if we're looking for that gap to reach the amount of T, it doesn't have to go as far left to reach that amount of T. So the dead rate loss triangle with demand in S1 is this one. But if we use demand in S2, it would be something more like this. Again, this red line here is that same amount of T. We just wouldn't have to go as far left to get there. So that triangle would be this one here, which would be our dead rate loss if we had to use S2, which is a smaller triangle. Why is it smaller? Well, because the height of both of these triangles, this one here and this one here, the height of both of those is T, and the base for this triangle here is smaller than for this bigger triangle here. So by definition, the area is smaller. So dead weight loss is smaller when one of the curves is more inelastic. That's what this picture is showing you. And so that's the idea that more inelasticity in the market means less dead weight loss. Another way to think about it is, intuitively, when the market is more inelastic, people don't change their behavior much when you tax them. And really what we care about, and this is an important theme throughout the class, dead weight loss is not in itself kind of a bad thing. It's a measure of a government program causing distortions in behavior. Right? The government program has made people do things that they wouldn't have done otherwise. And that's a proxy for sort of, it's making them worse off. Right? More inelastic curves means actually we're going to keep doing what we were doing. This policy, it then just becomes a transfer of money from people in society to the government. And that's sort of the thing you want to kind of get comfortable with. The idea of if demand is totally inelastic, taxing a market like that is just transferring money from people in society who are buying this good, like let's say cigarette smokers, right? They have totally inelastic demand. Then a tax on cigarettes is just transferring money from cigarette smokers to the government. It's like them writing a check to the government. And we're going to keep doing what we're doing. We're going to smoke the same number of cigarettes. We're just going to pay you in the form of a check, which is no dead weight loss associated with that. In the same way that if Bartek gives me $1,000, it would be awesome, but it would also have to be no dead weight loss at all. Prices aren't being distorted. Behaviors aren't changing. Bartek feels a negative income effect. I feel a positive income effect that cancels it out. And we're back to where we started in terms of total social welfare. So inelasticity means less dead weight loss. And then, you can kind of go through here. I talked about, on here I just replicated the notes from API-101 from my section notes. This is useful because it's very similar to what the professor talked about in class. Some of the things that might cause elasticity to be different over time. And this is just a reminder of what we talked about last semester, and you might see some similarities in terms of what we talked about this semester with capital tax incidence over time changing, necessities versus luxuries. And then we talked about the Ramsey rule, down here at the bottom, is kind of a result of this, which is we added on this semester. Taxing inelastically demanded goods is efficient relative to taxing more elastically demanded goods. And why is that? Well, it's the reason we just talked about, right? More inelastic means less dead weight loss when you tax in that market, a given amount, $2 per good. It's going to have less of an impact in a market with inelastic demand. So this logic, this pure efficiency logic, would say you should tax inelastic markets. But clearly, there's some concerns we might have about that related to what we see up here. What are the kinds of goods that are inelastic versus elastic? And you see right here in that first line, there's one problem. Right? Necessities are inelastic, luxuries are elastic. So who's going to be hit by a tax if we just tax inelastic goods. People who are buying necessities, everyone in the country needs necessities, rich and poor, right? So clearly, for lower income people, necessities make a bigger percentage of their budget. So there may be an equity problem there. You can go down the road and see, well, what are the kinds of goods that the Ramsey rule would say we should tax more? And why might there be problems with each of those? So that's kind of the tax incidence side. Then we kind of moved into some new material a little bit here. With labor supply, debit loss, and kind of moving into taxes a little bit more.